Welcome to our focus session this afternoon. And you all know me, I'm Jim Sauer, and I'd like to welcome our focus session presenter. I have known Peter since 1987 when I attended one of his classes. And it is not an oxymoron to have a Jesuit who's also a liturgist. I was trained by the monks at St. Mindred for college, and many of our seminarians and priests from the Evansville Diocese were trained there. So I've had a rich Benedictine spirituality. Then I studied at the University of Innsbruck under Hans Bernhard Meyer, who was the disciple of Joseph Jungmann, who happened to die on the day I was ordained a deacon, not because I was a deacon, but just the day the Lord called him home. But the liturgy was rather strange. I don't know if I ever shared that with you. When he died, he was placed on a black catafalque and 6 candles and no celebration of the funeral mass. And so here was the great liturgist of the Vatican Council, and it was like all theory but no praxis, you know. And it was rather strange. So it's possible to have a Jesuit who is a liturgist. Then in 1987, I went out to Creighton University to study for 4 summers, and I said, well, this is interesting. Here's another Jesuit teaching liturgy. And I said, well, I think I'll take his class. Peter Fink. What an unusual name for a professor of theology. But Peter is a professor emeritus of sacramental liturgical theology from the former Weston Jesuit School of Theology. That was from 1975 to 2006 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then in 2006 he had a conversion experience, and he became the associate pastor of St. Francis Xavier Church. It's called retirement. He's associate pastor in New York City. And I've always been the opposite. I've been working in parish ministry, and I've always wanted to get into the world of academia, but I get a little bit too old for that now, too. Peter was the editor of the New Dictionary of Sacramental Worship, put out by Liturgical Press, and it's a book that I have used many times over. It's been a very big help for me. Personally, I really enjoyed Peter's class at Creighton University, and that was maybe about 10 years after I was ordained. And when I was first ordained, I was assigned to a pastor in Evansville, and I really wasn't that wild or, you know, avant-garde, but I would make some changes in the liturgy. And the priest had a problem with alcohol, and he said, I guess he was my first encounter with the liturgical police. And he said, one day during dinner, he said, you changed that second Eucharistic prayer 5 times. And that's the shortest prayer, you know, one written supposedly by Hippolytus. So I went back and checked it. Well, I changed it 15 times that day. And he said, on what authority are you changing that? And so the only defense I had was to say, well, when you have our 5 communion services every day, do you follow the ritual of, you know, blah, 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 blah? He said, well, I don't have to. That's not an official ritual of the church. I said, well, yes, it is. You know, you just can't give out communion with the Confiteor and Our Father and whatever. You have to follow the official ritual of the church. So I asked Peter the question in class, and I said, Peter, how can I answer this man? And he said, well, let's look at the liturgical documents and see if you do it on your own authority or the authority of liturgical renewal. And Peter gave me a lot of freedom. Not freedom just to do what I wanted to do. It really helped me to understand the whole issue of liturgical reform, what the council was calling us to do as priests, but also how to use the liturgy, how to use the prayers, so I could really lead the people in prayer. And so when we started putting this assembly together, I said, we're getting Peter Fink to come and do a focus session. And so he very graciously with not too much arm twisting, decided to come back. And so I'm very happy to introduce and to welcome Father Peter Fink, who's going to do the principles of liturgical renewal in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, and how we can use those in terms of the new Roman Missal. So Peter, thank you very much for being with us. And I can stay for another session, but I'm going to go out and go to another focus session. So thank you, Peter, very, very much for being with us.
Now I get the camera all to myself.
Here's Peter.
Thanks, everybody. I said in the session right before this, I said a word of welcome, but the welcome really is not a welcome me to you or you to me, but a welcome of our coming together. This is somewhat of a counterpoint, I guess, a lot that has been going for many years coming out of Rome. And I've been trying to figure out exactly what is in fact happening, what are coming, how does the stuff that comes from Rome end up in this book that we now have, which is a rather strange item on many levels. We heard last night, heard even with Anthony this morning. I guess for a long time I had been pretending, at least, that there was nothing, as the book was being presented or prepared for us, saying that there was nothing here that would counter Vatican II. And the more I have looked at it, the more wrong I have been. I mean, on so many levels, there are so many different ways in which the movement of this book, everything it suggests, goes counterpoint to the wisdom and vision that was put in the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And so it really is, it has become a question to me to try and figure out what's the difference, how does that difference show itself? On a level of observation, it would be one way of trying to see how this book is different from the vision of Vatican II. Has to do with the language that frequently comes out of Rome, and that's the language of continuity versus discontinuity. I'll talk more as we go through this, that, when the Reform took place, there was a great deal of discontinuity in terms of the way the Church prayed. It brought in a whole different theological tradition. A theological tradition that is more Eastern than it is Western. A theological tradition that is earlier than what was developed in the West. A theological tradition that, in fact, I became very comfortable with because I worked, in addition to being a Latin priest, I worked with the Maronite tradition for 25 years, and began to see that is a very different way in which the wisdom of the Church is passed on to the people of God. And yet, the language that frequently comes out of Rome is not the language of discontinuity, the language of a different tradition coming in side by side with the older tradition, but the language of continuity, that anything that happens now can be drawn into what has been before. And that language of continuity has something to do with a lot of what's in that book, because it is trying to take something that was captured by the Roman sacramentary, which we know had good stuff and bad stuff in it, but something that was captured by that, and trying to bring that into the tradition of the old Roman Missal. And the question is, can that be done without doing violence to one or the other? So that's at least, as a first statement, that there's something about that movement of continuity, how you keep the ongoing tradition. And the Western Church has been very famous for that. Eastern churches tended, whenever they went to different places, they just developed in new ways. Whereas, there are as many rites in the Western Church as there are in the Eastern Church, but they've been absorbed. There is no Celtic Church anymore. There is the Sacrament of Reconciliation, some pieces of it. There's no Frankish Church in it, which was very much the church that did confirmation right after Eucharist, right after baptism, rather, that kind of thing. There are many ways in which the evolution in the West has just been drawn into. And in some ways, this book is trying to draw into the tradition of the Roman West, what was presented to us in the wisdom and witness of Vatican II. And so that'll come through, but I just want to highlight at the beginning. Let me just say something about myself. I guess intellectually, I was trained by John Gallen, who was one of the early people in the church, the Vatican II church, who did a great deal of service for the church. He nudged me away from the world of physics to the world of theology. And what he trained me in, and this is probably the thing I captured the best of, he trained me into seeing the liturgy as the living prayer of a people. Not something that you did, not something that was an audience sort of thing. I mean, it was sort of like, if they're, it's not like the people don't go to Mass, the people come together, and coming together, they are the Mass. That kind of thing. It also trained me into saying that if you want to see what a sacramental ritual is about, you listen to the ritual. You don't listen to everything else that tells you what it should be. That the rituals themselves tell you what they will be. So there's something about letting the ritual itself and the people gathered for the ritual become the main issue of how you understand the sacrament, the church. After that, I spent most of my life then teaching, as Jim said, at Western Jesuit School of Theology. And one of the things that I learned, let's say, my own training was in systematic theology. And one of the things I learned over these years is that the church is more comfortable with what went before than it is with what is not yet. Great studies of biblical stuff. This is how we got it. This is how we understand it. This is, right here. Great studies of church tradition. This is how we got it. This is how it is. Great studies of liturgical theology. This is the way. In fact, there was a point there when the assumption was that everything that we had was the best of what has been passed on to us. Whereas a systematic theologian doesn't think that way. Systematic theologian says, that's nice, but now what? Where do we go? What wisdom, what witness, where can this lead you? It leads you in a variety of different directions. But the dealing with the past, everyone is comfortable with, but when you get to going where it is not yet, the phrase you will always get is, well, we don't want to confuse the people. That's the classic. And anything that is not yet will always automatically confuse the people. Not realizing that it's going to confuse the person pursuing it, but because it is not yet. But that's something else again. As I say, pastorally, I have faculties both of the Latin Church by birth and by ordination, and then I was able to join a Maronite church in Boston it was a weekend call that lasted 25 years. Mm-hmm. And the only regret I have of that is I didn't learn Arabic, and that's my deepest regret. But what it did was it made me realize that the Latin Church is 1/5 of the great church. The Latin Church is 1/5 of the great church. It doesn't mean, it may have the largest numbers, it may be the most overwhelming number-wise, but its tradition is no better or worse than the Coptic tradition, the Chaldean Nestorian tradition, the Byzantine tradition, the Armenian tradition, all of the traditions that have unfolded in the great church. It's only one of the many. And it made me realize that there is a great diversity of approaching God as Christian people than you can find simply in one of those traditions. The Byzantine tradition, for example, uses a lot of John's Gospel. Maronite tradition tends to use the Old Testament more commonly. The Latin tradition tends to use the Synoptic Gospels until you get to Easter, when you get the endless realm of John's Gospel, which drives everybody crazy trying to preach on it. But, it's sort of like there's a certain way in which the wisdom of the Scriptures unfolds in these different traditions, and I began to realize that's a very important part of the way I did my own work. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about today's session. When Jim asked me to do this, one of the focuses, which is in continuity both with the laments of last night and the presentation of Anthony this morning on the missal. But it was sort of, let's look at the book, not just the nature of the book. What is it doing? Why, but let's look at some pastoral procedures in dealing with the book, including the relationship to the decrees of Vatican II. And I guess if I tried to shape it, it was sort of like, let's use this book, which we all use now, and say, how does it square with the wisdom and promise of Vatican II? Now, on the most obvious level, one obvious point of venture on that would be the issue of the language itself. Because that's the one most of us have to deal with. In general, I say about this one as I said about the last one. Some of it's good, some of it's baffling, some of it's tolerable. The point that Anthony made this morning about that 1997 text, it tried to take what we had and improve it, as opposed to take what we have and reject it and start something new, do something different. So something should be said in the conversation. I'm sure you'll bring it up, issues about the language in the book, but some issues of my own. I don't tend not to use the formal or the other language of the youth. I tend to use the language of the genius of the English language versus the genius of the Latin language. And that the attempt, for good or for bad, the attempt of the sacramentary tradition was to let the genius of the English language determine the translation. In fact, in one of that early one from the American bishops, they had a thing on translation where it said that the unit of meaning is not the word, but the phrase. And therefore the phrase itself, if the phrase captures the meaning of the Latin phrase, that's the proper translation, as opposed to word by word literal thing. That has unfortunately disappeared. You don't find that in later versions of it. But somehow or other, the genius of the English language as the norm for translation went from being highly desirable to totally unacceptable. And somehow the genius of the Latin language went from being outdated, unintelligible, and without much content to being desirable, accepted, and preferred. And so you put it that way, basically it's saying that not only is the translation styled by Latin, but that Latin ultimately is what should lead us in prayer, as opposed to the English language leading us in prayer. That's where I see the thing. But now I've seen nothing that tells me why that shift took place. Somehow or other it was just decreed that this We used to use this, now we're using this. It's been said that the language is more poetic and noble. I personally have found that it's quite unpoetic. Very hard to sing and intrusive, more intrusive than noble. I was talking with Anthony at lunchtime today that, one of the things I realized is that a lot of people involved in translation, either that approve it or are working on it, are musicians. It's almost as though that they have a sense of something about the language and its usability that the rest of us may not have. But in addition to this one, I was working with the translation of the Maronite liturgy, which is also being done by a musician from Australia. And it's fascinating. It's a much better translation, but at least there's something about letting the music dictate something about the translation that doesn't usually get in the conversation. The hope was to make it more prayerful. Many see it more clumsy than prayerful. I know I think some people mentioned that last night, that you come away from a Mass feeling less involved than I did beforehand. It's just a feeling, but it measures how I've been able to enter into the text as opposed to using other texts and other ways of praying. So something about that needs to be raised, but there's another piece which I've begun to reflect only recently on, and that is apart from the language issue, and it's independent of the language, is that what symbol structure is being presented. If you, for example, have a ritual that includes people as opposed to a ritual that sends people away, you are making a statement one way or the other. A statement that feels inclusive or a statement that feels alienated. And I think that's a kind of question that should be in the back of our minds, namely, how are we communicating through the very rituals that we're doing? What are we saying? Are we in fact thinking that we're welcoming people, but in fact not? I think even one simple example of that to me would be in the people who put in the bulletin saying only Catholics can receive communion, which in fact has never been a Catholic position. The Catholic position is you cannot invite people, but you can never turn them away. And that's to put in to say only Catholic are welcome is a non-Catholic statement. The Orthodox could do that, but we can't. So those are the kind of things that we create images that alienate or welcome. And that makes a big difference too in how the rituals themselves unfold. Now, going to the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, again, this is a decision you have to make. I firmly believe still that the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy is the document for liturgical reform in last century now into this. There have been infinite number of documents afterwards. They're all restrictive, explanatory. Some of them are silly, like, put your glass away and make sure that you have a metal cup kind of thing. Some of them are more serious, like taking the ritual for auxiliary minister and lector away from the laity where they were originally designed and putting it back into the priestly thing. Those are all little things that have happened, but they're all negative, many of them have been negative in their development. But they don't take away the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. So that whatever it was in 1963, it still is now 49 years later. And the language that it offers is not just, wasn't it nice back then and we can move away from it, but what can we learn from it today? Okay. Now, if you look at the counts, that particular document, it lists, at the very beginning, it lists 4 things that are not just the aim of the Constitution on the liturgy, but the aim of the whole gathering, the aim of the council itself. And I think it's worthwhile hearing them and asking yourself, how does this thing stand up today, 50 years later? Like, for example, the first one, it desires to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. Now, in the world that you live in, can you judge that to be a true statement? Can you judge it to be a mixed statement? But the aim of the council, the primary aim, was to impart an ever-increasing vigor to the Christian life of the faithful. Opening paragraph. So the question for every priest is whether this book does or does not accomplish this. In some places it can. In some places it can't. But at least to let that be one of the major sense of the vision of Vatican II, how does it play out in this book? And you can only answer that in practice. Nobody can write to you and say, this is the way your people will respond. It can only be answered in terms of the very interaction with the people who are being led in prayer. Second, to adopt more suitably to the needs of our own times those institutions which are subject to change. Now, I'd have to confess that, when the reform began to unfold itself, one of the things about all of the Eucharistic prayers, except Eucharistic Prayer 1, is that they all follow the same pattern. They all follow the same pattern of telling the story, which included the words of institution, offering, invocation of spirit, doxology. There's a certain movement of that. Every one of them follows that, except the Roman canon. The Roman canon is all focused on the image that the Roman canon uses when it uses the language of sacrifice, is the image of Abel and Isaac, Cain and Abel rather, Isaac and Abraham and Isaac. The image of sacrifice outside of yourself, whereas the actual image of the other prayers is the Paschal sacrifice, the Passover sacrifice, which is a very different kind of sacrifice. It is the sacrifice that the people do, as opposed to something that is done. Okay? So, to adapt more suitably to the needs of our times, I thought, a lot of people thought, oh, I guess that really ends the Eucharistic Prayer 1. In fact, Tom Clark, I think, wrote something years back on the end of the Latin Church, because it really did open itself up to the Eastern world. Another example would be the inclusion at the very beginning of the sprinkling rite. Now, the sprinkling rite was designed to allow the people to exercise their own baptismal reality as you begin the Sunday liturgy. If you'll notice in the current sacramentary, that baptismal ritual doesn't exist anymore. It does, actually. It's tucked in the back of the book. You really have to hunt it down. And it's there as some sort of a nice thing that you may want to use on some rare occasion. But you're right back to the, oh God, I'm miserable kind of opening of the ritual, which isn't what the Vatican II document really was trying to say. They're trying to say that our baptismal rite is the one that should start us. And then on certain seasonal times, we can use the more restricted one. Okay? The third one, to foster whatever can promote union among all who believe in Christ. Now, Anthony mentioned that this morning, and I totally agreed with what he said. I have heard the same thing. that the attempt of the various Western Christian communities who have used the search for common texts, people are just terribly saddened to find that a whole movement of translation that's going on that had no connection with the attempt to have a common text. And finally, the last one, to strengthen whatever can help to call the whole of humankind into the household of the church. Well, I think, I found, maybe you find the same, that there is still a great movement of people entering the church. But I've never heard entering the church because of the Roman Missal. I've never heard that the liturgical thing, at least as the book is there, is what does it. The liturgy does it when the people gather and sing, when the people gather and pray, when the people gather to welcome, when the people do all of that stuff. That's what makes a community. People say, I think I want to be part of it. So I think I like what you have. That's why people come into the church. But very rarely do you find somebody saying, oh, I was reading your missal, and that really kind of turned me on. There was, I had to think about that. There was a fellow ordained a year ahead of me who entered the church because he loved the Latin liturgy, just as the Latin liturgy was fading. Poor guy, didn't have a very happy life after that. And then, at any rate, if these are set before us simply as this is what the council had in mind, well, I think that's important for any of us to hold up to ourselves and say, is this what's happening? And if not, how do we get back to allow it to happen again? How do we take this ritual, take the parishes or the people that we work with, how do we take that as a primary thing to help them grow in their faith? If in fact it's happening, there's nothing to do. If it's not happening, then that needs to be a question. Similarly, the things that are subject to, there are some things that are back in the book that probably should have died. And there are probably some things that were in the book that are no longer there that should be there. But I mean, it's a question of asking yourself, when we do this, are we in fact taking something that is an authentic part of the development of the church, or are we intruding it with some other kind of strange things that have come from late medieval or early or recent times. All right, let's turn to the reform itself. I like to say that there are 3 levels of the reform. And I like to mention the first one, which has already happened. And I think many of us in this room have already lived it. And the reason I like to hold on to it is because, I tend to see what we're having now is the once and future church, the once and future liturgy. That we had a liturgy that was presented to us that people found successful. The hope is there will be a liturgy that will be presented to us and people will find it successful. It's somewhere in between that right now. Okay. But I think that it's good to remember the excitement of the time from 63 to 73 and 83, when things like the use of the vernacular, the expanded lectionary, the initiation rites, the concelebration rather than private masses, all of those things got people excited and got people into it. And I think it's just important to remember that maybe we'll never get that excitement again. But it's nice to have a time when that was that kind of excitement. Because it was more than just a nice thing. It's a sense that something was happening. As opposed to when you get a sense of things diminishing. And there's that feeling of delight or that feeling of not so delight. The second level, which is the one that Jim really wanted me to kind of address, is what I call the level of norm or principle. And what I mean about this is really taking things right out of the book again. This is not a great discovery on my part. It's more than just an issue of practical procedure. What these norms and principles were at the time, they were the norms to guide the liturgical reform. But there's nothing in there that said those norms are over. They are norms to guide liturgical reform, whether it be then or now or in the future. And where they have their value, as I say, this goes back to the statement, is Vatican II Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy normative, which I believe it is, then these norms are normative not just for then, but for now and ongoing. And where they're of value here is they can serve us now in estimating and moving with what's ahead of us. The norms themselves, as I say, none of them are absolute. And that is in itself a shift in a pattern. Because the norms, what used to be before the council was you have a liturgical question, you send it off to Rome, they send you an answer back. You know, it was all very simple. And anything that happened, you would get an answer for. And these norms don't give you answers. They lead you to a point of making responsible decisions. And responsible decisions are not simply, your responsible decision may not be the same as mine. Right? That's what I mean. They're not so absolute that everybody's got to answer the same thing. And in fact, we have to put them together. By putting them together, that's what makes them helpful, because it brings you out of the theory into the world that you're dealing with. You yourself, your ability to do things, and the people you're praying with. That's where these things come in. So the first one is one that everyone knows about. It's the one called active participation. You know, it's very simple in the Constitution when it says, the Church earnestly desires that all the faithful be led to that full, conscious, and active participation in liturgical celebrations called for by the very nature of the liturgy. Such participation is the right of the Christian people by reason of their baptism. Yeah, that's something we've all heard that before. But it really, it's very clear. It says, as a principle, in the reform and promotion of the liturgy, this full active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered above all else. Now that's about as pretty absolute as you can be, you know. And if you see things that have happened, and we've seen a number of things that have happened that tend to move away from, rather than enhance, that full and active participation. Whether it be, who can do the readings, whether it can be who can do homilies, whether it can be. I mean, all of the things that, that basically are trying to say, there's a different way we're going to proceed and have lots of people involved in things. In fact, I discovered in putting this together something which was in 2007, Pierre Murgy was writing a reflection on Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy, and Ratzinger made a response to it. And in terms of that continuity issue, for example, it says, Ratzinger says, that the change in the liturgy is situated in the great continuity of the history of the liturgy, in which there is always growth and purification, but not rupture. That means continuity all the way through. But at any rate, G starts out by saying that the only thing on the liturgy that Ratzinger refers to is the active participation, which it says the Cardinal considers dangerous because it seems to involve, quote, a risk that the church may celebrate itself, unquote. Now, there's obviously a bias in reading that. And so that's what you can hear that, you can laugh at it, but there's clearly a different way of perceiving what's going on. Because the humanness of this gathering is either a nice club or a family of faith. If it's a family of faith, they're not celebrating themselves. They're celebrating their faith. They're celebrating, So, but there's, to reduce it to simply a gathering, rather than the depth of what this gathering is about. That's where there's a non-sync here, But I think that's part of the issue, The reason we have to hasten again the specialness of the priest is that it keeps you from focusing on this club that we have out here. But the club isn't out there. The club is with Christ out there. So, at any rate. So that first one, but a clear example of how this one unfolds in the two rituals. In the Trent version, it says, "Which I, your unworthy servant, offer unto you on behalf of all here present." It's a clear, I offer on behalf of. As opposed to, through your goodness, we have these gifts to offer. It's a very clear movement that says this is what we've gone from an individual kind of thing to the full and active participation of the people itself. And what's significant, too, is the reason for it. It's not simply because it's a nice idea. The reason for it is guided by the nature of the liturgy itself. I've always been fascinated by people who say, well, this is the way it should be because this is what tradition tells us it is, outside telling you what a ritual should be. And I say, well, look at the ritual itself. What does it ask you to do? I think we would get a much better sense of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist if we understood what it meant to eat and to drink. If you put something else in there, you're not going to get a sense of why Christ chose food to be his presence. So you look at the ritual itself, and because it's guided by reason of their baptism. Those are both reasons why there is this need for active participation. The second principle, first one is active participation. The second one is clear signification. The first one was section 14, if you wanted to text that. And this one is section 21. The liturgy is made up of immutable elements, divinely instituted, and of elements subject to change. These may not only ought to be changed with the passage of time if they have suffered from the intrusion of anything out of harmony with the inner nature of the liturgy or have become pointless. And I think that what this is really trying to articulate for us is that the symbols of our ritual speak. You don't need anything outside of the ritual itself. They speak, and people understand them as they are spoken. The third one, which is the communal nature of the liturgy. Liturgical services are not private functions, celebrations belonging to the whole church. And the principle, whenever rites make provision for communal celebration involving the presence and active participation of the faithful, it is to be stressed in this way of celebrating them, and that's to be preferred to one that is private or semi-private. I was thinking about that when someone was talking about Dozier's thing with the Sacrament of Reconciliation. That was clearly, in fact, a lot of people don't see this, but this is one of the real conflicts with the Sacrament of Reconciliation. If you see it as a private venture, you'll never understand the communal nature of it. If you see it as a communal nature, you could understand the private nature of it. But it's It's sort of like those are two realities that are in the ritual itself, but not totally understood as to be two different ways of doing the same thing. Then there is the one of the diversity of rites. That too, Anthony suggested something on this morning. Provision shall be made in the revision of liturgical books for legitimate variations and adaptations to different groups. There was a priest on our faculty up at Weston, Paulus priest, who has gone around to various places, and he does things on doing DVDs of what he calls the Dancing Church. He's got a Dancing Church of Africa, Dancing Church of the Pacific. On the Dancing Church of the Pacific, they had an ordination. And if you ever want to see how different realities don't make it when they come together, they have the ordination procession comes in, women came dancing, and the men came carrying candles, all sorts of things. Then this vested chasuble came walking down the aisle. And you look at it and say, oh my God. I mean, it just, it makes you ask yourself, what would an ordination look like that really took these people seriously? What would you wear? How would you pray? How would you make it in such a way that this was, in fact, the liturgy of the church and not a clash of Roman vestments and nice and sunny flowers, and a final one that I want to add is, and what I'd like to do is finish this part and then see what kind of conversation we have. If there's more, we can go back to other things later. But this one is on the creative role of the priest presider. And this is that phrase that I'm sure you have looked at before. Pastors of souls, and that's what we are, pastors of souls must therefore realize that when the liturgy is celebrated, something more is required than the mere observation of the Lord's governing, valid, and licit celebration. It is their duty also to ensure that the faithful take part, fully aware of what they are doing, actively engaged in the rite, and enriched by its effects. And that really raises a question about what are we doing as presiders? Because of the newness of this book, because of the kind of thing that Anthony was talking about, the power levels that are behind it, the whole levels of what's really going on behind the scenes, all sorts of language comes up about, well, you can't change anything. And to which I just look and say, there has never been a time in the history of the church that a ritual has been performed exactly the way it's presented to them. If that was done, it wouldn't have been the ritual of the church. We're not reciters. We're ordained to serve people's prayer. Now, sometimes that can be done if I pray a prayer that's given me. Sometimes it can be done if I fool around a little bit, but be able to pray. And sometimes you can't pray it at all. I remember praying one prayer, and this was in the old one, so this is not a question new or old. But I was in a prayer in Lent, and I got to the end of it, I just went, oh God, you deserve better than this. It was just an awful prayer. And I think this sometimes you can react to things and you say, this is strange. But I think the deep question is there, am I there to lead prayer, or am I there to simply recite a text? And that has really nothing to do with, the bishops may not like it and all that sort of thing. And that's a whole different realm of discourse that I pray that none of us really have to deal with, but probably you always will. But ultimately, you say, that's why I wasn't ordained to recite a text. I was ordained to lead people in prayer. And I can only do that by listening to the people I pray. I was at it a long time ago in my early years as a priest on Long Island, and it was the only time I literally wanted to walk off the altar. When I get up there and say, the Lord be with you. Glory to God in the highest. You know, and finally I said to myself, I have no idea why I'm here. Now, I went through it, but that was the inner gut feeling was, I have no idea, this is not leading you in prayer. Most of the time, we have people sing, we have people pray, you know, that's why I'm here. And that's to me, that thing that you can only pick it up when you do it. And that's why ultimately, just to recite will never be the mission of the presider. It may be a mission of somebody, but not the mission of the presider. Okay, as I said, I'm just going to stop here and see what kind of conversation can come. There are other ways I can go on to it, but let's just see what kind of comes out.
Besides Eucharistic liturgy, I think we had a little time of experimentation, probably a little bit longer in our own particular diocese, because the bishop allowed it, of the third rite of reconciliation. And it was a very powerful experience.
Which?
Toledo.
Okay.
A very powerful experience for people. For the first time, they understood what reconciliation was about the communal aspect of it. And it was put down, I don't know the reason, and I think it was a failure because, the put down was a failure because I think we had a tool to deal with what came later in the church, namely the sexual abuse scandal, that we cannot heal as a community because we don't have a communal rite of reconciliation, and we've lost something. And I think we need that right more than ever. I mean, we're talking about, ritual and the full conscious participation in all the sacraments, especially.
It's funny, even apart from the sexual abuse thing, because that really has been a very serious intrusion on the whole sacrament, any sacramental one-on-one kind of relationship. But if you look right in the ritual itself, I always call it the introduction to that ritual is totally schizophrenic. On the one hand, it talks about the ritual as new beginnings, personal change, that kind of thing, on a personal level. And then, if you turn the page, it talks about the purpose of that ritual is for a community to express its belief that God forgives us. Okay. Now, if you take the first one, then it's got to be totally personal. You don't say this is going to be personal and you must do it once a month. You can't do it once. If it's totally personal, it's got to be when I need to do it. It might even be I might do it for several months and really only experience the sacrament once, because that's what a personal thing is about. And the other one is where we come together, not really because we are in desperate need, but because that's part of our faith, that everything we believe in has come from God. And if you look at the ritual, the third ritual is the one that gives that part. The first ritual is the one that gives the private one. And the one in the middle tries to be successful in both and isn't successful in either. But if you put them up there, if you take this one as primary, then you can't do it, you can't go to this one again unless you bring it back here. If you take this one primary, then you'd say, you shouldn't do this one twice until you brought it up here. Up here, I would be telling you, hey, it does work. Down here, I would be saying, what you told me about, in fact, has happened. So both of those are part of it, but you're right, we've lost that whole second dimension of it to say that the only way we do it is the one-on-one thing. And as I say, it's you get a lot of people that come in and say, I haven't been here for a while. Yeah, I think that's a...
When the council ended and we started to do the new liturgy, very frequently I went to places where the people themselves made the bread and the loaf. And in some cases the priest broke it, sometimes they passed it around. I mean, is there a preference in terms of the significance of the liturgy and the bread instead of using a wafer, an actual loaf of bread?
That's one of those nightmare issues. When we started at St. Francis Xavier, myself and the current other person on the staff, they had people baking the bread. On the one hand, it was reported to the cardinal as complaining that you could have gotten it right off the supermarket kind of thing, that it was bought bread, not realizing that even hosts are bought bread. So on the other hand, what we had the problem with was not so much that, but it started out as a ministry, and people would prepare the bread. It ended up being one person preparing it all the time. Sometimes it was well done, sometimes it was not well done. Sometimes, in other words, it was a kind of thing that, and also it had to be, at least in some shape or form, because of the Latin tradition, close to being as, without yeast, and therefore looking very, very hard to do. So we ended up going from the bread back to the wafers just simply because it was not helpful on anybody's level. Is there a reason? If you push it back, it goes back to the fact that we in the West focus on the synoptics, and the East focuses on John's Gospel. John's Gospel is not a Passover, so they use leavened bread. All right, it is Passover, so we use unleavened bread. That's where it goes back to. Is there anything more than just that? I don't know. I don't think there is any preference. I think the preference, to me at this point, I would say the preference would be which helps people pray better. But
I mean, I've heard so many people who have gone to the Middle East and come back and say, Jesus probably used something much like what we know as pita bread. So it makes much more sense.
more like the matzah. More like the matzah.
To use that kind of bread rather than a wafer.
I'm at a parish right now where for the last 30 years we've baked our own bread. We have probably 20 people
That's where it makes a lot of sense.
who do that. Sometimes the quality is, but I say, that's how human beings are. We try to correct that. It's sizable, and it works.
Good.
And Rembrandt talked about the importance of, the quality of signs.
Yeah, that's the issue. Yeah.
We're moving away from that. I mean, the whole thing of 15 cups on the altar is ridiculous.
I think that when you raise the issue of the quality of signs, that's a Vatican II question.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a Roman question right now. Just the opposite would be the Roman question. But I agree with you. The issue would be, that's that clear signification. What is it that speaks? How does the ritual speak what we believe it to be?
It seems to me that it should always be as close to one loaf and one cup as possible that you're praying over. And we're so far away from that right now. It's pathetic.
You don't like this? No,
I thought there was one of the documents did speak about that bread should be resemble as close as possible to real bread.
It's a hard one to do when you're in the tradition of an unleavened bread.
Yeah.
That's the tradition.
But that rubric used to be in the old sacramentary. We looked past it every time we prayed it. It was right there in red. It's no longer there. It should appear as to be bread. It was also the rubric that people should receive bread consecrated at the Mass they participate in. That rubric is no longer there.
That started with Pius XII.
Did it?
Yeah, Pius XII in 1947, and then Paul VI repeated it, and it's So it's nothing, it's not even a Vatican II innovation.
You know, I say most of Vatican II was due on Mediator Dei before that. Yeah.
You said that the quality of the sign is not the Roman question today. What would you characterize as the Roman question? What are they trying to...
Well, no, I shouldn't say. The quality of the signs they're looking at are different signs. They're looking at the signs that elevate the priest, that lessen the participation of the people, because the theology piece, just think it in terms of an architecture. An architecture of the Roman ritual has the people here coming up to the priest, who takes them with him to Christ and the Father. That's the image, and that's, if you want to get, well, he's playing with it. No, I mean anything that fits into that kind of maneuver, that's the ultimate symbol that they're trying to recreate. So anything that would diminish, that would elevate, they're not yet talking about the priest facing the wall yet, but this whole silliness of Ad Orientem, which essentially is trying to get that, saying, Benedict always talked about we should all be facing the same way, which is an Eastern reality and not one of the great witnesses or wisdoms of the East, actually. But the idea there is they see it as Christ coming up from the East. That's the way they do that. But the only reason we have it, the altar facing the wall, was so that people could see the host. This goes back to the medieval kind of thing when they were raising the host so that they could see. But this whole idea of now they're saying we should all be facing the same way is going to be, I'm here, leaving you here, that way. So it's still back to that same linear piece.
Which
if
is
you
Old
get
Testament.
into the Vatican II one, it's basically Christ in the midst of the church, gathering all of us together into his worship of Abba. It's a three-dimensional. This other one is only two-dimensional. So anything that tries to get into, whereas the priest, the altar, everything is sort of in a centerpiece where people gather around. That's the persona Christi there, is to represent Christ in his prayer. But it's Christ here raising up prayer to Abba, as opposed to us here trying to reach Christ who's up there with him. It's two different images.
You said earlier, that these things are normative and not absolute. But man, if you change some things, there are people in that congregation, Archbishop or Bishop, so-and-so did this or did that. But an extreme example also, I know in one parish where Father changed some words, and then afterwards the man came up and said, I didn't receive communion because, you did this and you did that. And the priest said, of course, I'm sure God is very happy with your choice. But you've got such ridiculous, extremes. And I think what you were saying, this is normative, and anyone who's got any kind of a brain, if he feels that changing some of the words will help people to have the experience of what the liturgy is about. And that's the primary goal, I think, of many of us. Not to make it correct, which is almost the magical kind of thing. If you don't make the words as it is, it's not going to happen. But I think there are a lot of people that it really is still not just normative, but it's absolute.
Yeah.
And if you don't say it, the bishop's going to come down on you. And I think it's very
but
true.
this is where you get into the politics, which I find fascinating, is why does this strange one person who gets turned off by your changing something have the power to get the bishop to react, to send you a letter, rather than the whole crowd of people who are led in prayer, writing to the bishop, and you'll never get, in other words, we keep giving these strange, extreme people power that they really ought not have. And that's what that is. In some ways, even this gathering is going to start threatening people, threatening bishops and all that sort of thing.
I'm concerned about the way they're doing the shapes of churches now. After Vatican II, we made these nice round churches, and I rebuilt one very nicely. People loved it being round, but now they're making them narrow. The tabernacles in the back up behind the altars.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Even behind the priest, some want the tabernacle in the middle,
Yeah,
which is nuts.
yeah.
but they're taking it out of the side, they're eliminating.
Well, you put it in the middle, that will make, that's the prime focus when you walk into the church, with or without anybody there, is the tabernacle.
Because that's the real presence.
That's the real presence. Yeah, yeah. And those are the kind of things that are distortions that I would say back in the days of post-Vatican II church reform, that I would judge had to have been distortions. To create, I mean, it's the chicken and egg problem, but in point of fact, the Blessed Sacrament comes from the Church's Eucharist, and the Blessed Sacrament should lead people back to the Church's Eucharist. That's clear in the statements. But in point of fact, if you do it without those words, you could make people think that the real issue is Christ in the tabernacle, and we don't want to get in the way. So, what did they used to do when I was a kid? They used to put a cloth in front of it, in front of the exposed Eucharist during Mass, and they would take it away. And it was some kind of craziness, but it was, yeah. I mean, one of the things I feel really sad about it, there's a certain kind of idolatry that we can do in dealing with the Blessed Sacrament, which I find, when I was a kid, you prayed to the Blessed Sacrament to keep Jesus company. And finally you realize, we're not praying to keep him company, he's there to help us. And that's a very different thing. But, but the reality of it, I mean, what we've lost, very briefly, we talked about the fourfold presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And we keep diminishing three of them and focusing back on the bread and wine, with or without anybody eating. And yet, I love the thing of Augustine when he said, it's the food, eating of the food, it's what we become by eating the food. That's the real presence. That's what those words mean.
We renovated a church 13 years ago and followed that book, Environment and Art. And we did put the tabernacle back in the corner near a door where people could come in if they wanted to. And then we got a new bishop, I'm from Worcester, Bishop McManus came, and he clearly doesn't like tabernacles other than behind the altar. And his own piety, on the left, there's always correction. On the right, when there's a fault, nobody gets lettuce. And when those majority of people write in about something on the right, it's just ignored. When he distributes Eucharist, like an ordination, when he's finished, his line is gone, he turns and hands the ciborium to his master of ceremonies, and then he genuflects in front of him.
Oh my God.
It's funny. One of the pieces, when it talks about who can change anything, and they have this long list of authoritative things, and the line that gets the liturgy police very happy about is that no one, even if he be priest, should change anything on his own authority. And the whole point of these things, why Jim even was so fascinated, invited me out in the first place, the whole point of these is that it's good Jesuit distinction on your own authority or on the authority of the Constitution of the Sacred Liturgy. Now, an example, remember when I was teaching out at John the 23rd, so a guy coming up with ordination, he really wanted to have, when you wash the hands, he wanted to make that a significant thing because he felt that was a beautiful prayer and he wanted it to be part of the liturgy. And I looked, I said, that's what they mean, changing on your own authority. I think the bishop doesn't like it. Well, it really doesn't matter whether the bishop likes it or not. That's the bishop changing on his own authority.
Would that be the same as guys announcing Catholics in good standing come for communion, the others sit down?
That's not a Catholic position.
No one's.
Catholic position is I cannot invite you, but I cannot turn you away. That's always what the Protestants say, if you're baptized, you can come. The Orthodox say, if you're not chrismated, don't come. The Catholics will always say, I can't invite you, but I can't turn you away.
So why do you think the authorities, the bishops, why aren't they correcting that?
They're the ones who are doing it.
Yeah.
Bishops are the ones who are doing it. I mean,
We only hear about priests doing it.
well, I've heard bishops do it, and that becomes a norm for a whole diocese.
Missalettes have to be.
Missalettes have it.
Yeah. If you publish a program, you usually have to put that in the program.
Yeah.
Weddings and stuff like that.
Yeah, and a point, I mean, I say it is just not a Catholic position. And I don't know where it came from, but I think it might come, I tend to think Benedict tends to be more on the Byzantine side. And it might come from that world because, unless you, if you, and I spent a whole month in Greece one time and couldn't go to communion because I wasn't an Orthodox. And they will question you.
Didn't it start when they started refusing communion to politicians?
Mm-hmm. Politicians, because of their things, the gay people, because of their thing, any of those things that got them nervous.
Yeah, anybody who's a pro-choice, and then you're known.
Pro-choice would be another one, yeah.
Which of course, and I think so many people have made an idol of the institutional church, and you're more, you got to follow the institutional church rather than gospel. And so what is the idol on the pedestal in your life? And I think that's what's happened with the institutional church in the life of many, many people, including clergy and a lot of other people.
I just come from Ocala, which is just 17 miles from here. First of all, there's a church there, and what's the role of the bishop about the church there that I always joke that's not even Catholic, but it's overly Catholic. He has instituted again the railings, and he has put the railings, and then he had to face the wall. I mean, he had to face the wall. And also,
is he using Latin yet? I mean,
there is a Latin man. There is.
Yeah, I was going to say that's all the dynamic. That this is all moving back to that. Go ahead.
Right. And the other thing that I would like to ask is, the diocese seems to be overly concerned, although they like to have a perpetual observation. For me, it's way too much. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, but how would these position for you?
Somebody had asked me that earlier. What about the perpetual adoration, or any kind of adoration? And I said, a lot of it depends on why you're doing it. If you're doing it as this replaces the Mass, that's idolatry. Because even in the best documents, it says that the Blessed Sacrament comes from the Eucharistic liturgy, and prayer in front of it should return you to the Eucharistic liturgy. That the Eucharistic liturgy is the prime reality, and that the reason that the sacrament is reserved is twofold. For those who couldn't be here, and as a sign of Christ's enduring presence in the church. Those are the two reasons. Now, if people do it for any other reason, then they're bordering on idolatry. And if people get into the fetish of, as you say, wafer watching or whatever, however you want to name it, I mean, there is a sense of replacement, and that which is in the tabernacle doesn't replace that which brought it the tabernacle in the first place.
Actually, they have a chapel aside from it.
What was the first reason?
Oh, it's for the sick. It's
For the sick, oh, yeah, I see.
it is for those who couldn't be
Of
here.
course.
Somebody who was sick or somebody who came in.
I wish I could build my own church and have a chapel of adoration. But you walk in and explain where it started, and if they could sit there and the prayer would be, open the eyes and ears of my heart. And then on the other side, as you walk out, the Lord says, now go where I'm present and need you. And that's where the whole thing of Matthew 25, 32, 46. And you probably could say to them, you're making me nervous as hell. You're just staring at me. But I'll tell you, where I need you is where I'm present, and it's going to cost you. It doesn't cost you much that you're going to sit there, and you probably feel really good. But there can be an advantage of that. A lot of people need a quieting down. And a lot of people probably need also to have the eyes and ears of their hearts open so they can know what the people around them, what their hungers are. And it's not just go to the soup kitchen, but they can also know what people around them hunger and thirst for, maybe opportunities for education and that kind of stuff. Now you go out and you do that. And where are people naked? How many people are stripped of their dignity? Listen and look and see about that. People are caught in the prisons of addictions and all this kind of stuff. Get off your ass and go out there and do that. And that's where you'll really be giving me adoration, or whatever it is. But what you've just done, you might go out and feel so good, I put so many hours of adoration. Well, the Lord says, great, but it doesn't meet what I say in the Last Judgment. So, I think you can really say to them, that can be a great thing. But the real thing, if it's giving you the energy to do what ultimately is asked of you.
I think what you're naming is, you're naming the spirituality of why somebody does it in the first place. And if, when I was a kid, we were told that you had to keep Jesus company. He was lonely, you had to keep him company. But I think a lot of people's prayer is still very much help, 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 help. They're not yet into the, I got to go and help somebody else. Very much, for even some of the prayers at Mass, some of our weekday Masses, I sit and I close my eyes and say, that is such a self-centered prayer. I'm thankful to God for all of the things He has given me and for all the graces I have received. And that all, and you say, hello, there's a world out there. But, I think a lot of people need to be educated on how to pray.
What's Jesus' bottom line? I'd like to know how you minister to God, by the way. Isn't that one of the Eucharistic prayers?
Yes.
Read that.
Minister to you.
I just want to comment on, we were talking about before about, people don't want to get into any of the changes. When Weekman was talking about getting behind the problems, where they really are, I think one of the major issues is the thought process that change is bad. When in fact, the reality is that life, by its very nature, means change. And I do parish renewals all over the country. That's the very first thing I talk about. Life is changing. If you can't be comfortable with change, you'll never be happy. But our culture says, get married, fall in love, and live happily ever after. You can be in this place forever. Work your butt off, and then you'll be in retirement where you live happily ever after. That's stupid thinking. So, the issue isn't the changes that it's the thought process that says we're not supposed to change. And I think that one of our major jobs is to help people understand that if you want to be healthy and happy, you have to shift your thought process with the way life goes.
What I'm seeing so much in the change is we went from a time when we really were concerned about community, and now it's the individual, which really translates liturgy into personal piety. That's just what's happening. With personal piety.
And it's personal, it's not communal. That thing that I mentioned about the dancing church of the Pacific,
Right.
that would be a communal piety.
Yeah.
Do you think many experts, liturgists, are going to write more about the truth of the matter, things like we're discussing here? It seems like very few people are writing it.
One of the things, and I'll be perfectly honest about this, but one of the laments I put at my community, on my table last night, and it's one I feel very, very deeply about, is that I have observed a lot of things happening and said nothing. I have observed things happening and have said nothing. I write, and so, sometimes when I've written, it's been rejected for the same, somebody else gets nervous about it. But it really is, I think what this group is the beginning of a process. I think that more and more people are beginning to get a sense that the more you look at this book, the more offensive it really is. I mean, it's not just offensive because of, consubstantial as opposed to one in being. And it's not really, it is trying to throw out a theology that people not only enjoyed, but felt at home in, and put back a theology that people no longer enjoy or feel at home in. And that's to me, once you get that happening, then you're going to get not reactions as much as beginnings of questions being raised. And
That's like, how did it happen type of thing?
yeah, how did it happen?
Yeah.
Why did it happen? I have in the back of my mind an article called "The Missile That Would Not Fly." Because it won't. I mean, people will people don't. The line, I think Jimmy somebody used it today. People can handle all those prayers because they don't listen to them. But we have to pray them.
Yeah, they're drifting, that's what.
And that's what, sooner or later, that's where the question, one of the places where I've begun to do this, at least in my own mind, when Benedict came out and said of this extraordinary form over against the ordinary form, that it's two different versions of the same liturgical tradition, my first reaction is, that's a lie. And my second reaction is, if you say it often enough, people will believe it, but it's still a lie. There's a difference in Christology. We talked about difference in ecclesiology. There's a difference in the role of the priest. There's a difference in the role of the assembly. There's a radical difference. And until people kind of capture that which was is being set aside and replaced by something else, nothing's going to happen. But when I see that particular statement, that's to me something I need to address, because it needs to be addressed. How I haven't yet figured out. I mentioned it once to my provincial, and he thought it wasn't a great idea because he's got to deal with the cardinal on sexual abuse. And it's caught into a whole network of things.
So
But
sad.
it's sad.
Well,
It
they
is very
removed the
sad,
editor a
but
few years ago of America. They seem to me to have tightened up a bit, but now
Tom-
they
Tom
seem
Rees-
way out on the limb again.
Tom Rees was thrown out for that reason, and now it's
It looks
yeah.
like someone else will be going soon, though.
yeah, right. Yeah.
But to their credit, I think to their credit.
But no, that's a real question. Are people beginning to raise those kind of issues? A lot of what has happened is, and I mentioned at the beginning, are people who are still into the history and things. So the problem, you can have a great historian who puts it out there, and you say, that's really terrific. But what he doesn't say is, and what you're asking is, anyone say the and? And that's the tough one. Because the nooses are hung up for those people.
And the liturgists at our universities and seminaries are all very discouraged. You hear that from them all the time. They're so discouraged.
Yeah. I said I started my great career with the whole Vatican II, and not only did it started here, got up there, and it's now down here somewhere.
Yeah.
That's demoralizing.
Oh.
Yeah, that's demoralizing. And sometimes I feel what a lot of folks feel. You come away saying, why bother? And that's not a healthy reaction.
No.
But that's the human instincts that why bother. And then you say, okay, I'll give you. Then somebody comes along and gives you a reason, and you keep going.
Who actually wrote this new edition?
It's funny. I had asked. I don't know. I was complaining about this new edition that if you watch Channel 13 and all of those British things, that you'd really appreciate this book, because, oh, dear God, we come summoned into your presence, O Lord. And then I'm told the Brits hate it too. So I mean, you can't say where, who. But I asked somebody, I said, someone from north of London was at least one of the chief people on this translation thing,
Yeah.
who knows nothing about liturgy. He's a translator.
Oh, my.
And so what he did was to give a good translation of it. So I mean, that question is one that probably should be asked and answered, but it's I'm not sure that who actually, because then they talk about the 10,000 changes that went in. So it's I'm not sure who they did.
We talked about one theology replacing another theology, but isn't the bigger issue that it's replacing a stance of the council? It's not just a question of competing theologies, which can be handled, but it's overriding direction that the council itself set. And which is what gives me long-term hope, that the council is going to prevail long-term.
I hope so, yeah.
I mean, I'd be interested in your view, because so many seem to be caught up in it, and I don't quite understand that. My own sense is that Ratzinger got scared in '68 with the revolutions that were going on in Europe, and he never has recovered from that. And I've been seeing some stuff in his writings that he refers back to that, that's still in his craw. And he saw the world going to hell in a handbasket, and so he started to say that we're on the wrong path. And we had a liturgist from Cleveland, I don't know if you know him, he's at the seminary there. He traced the whole thing from that, and these guys just moved into power over a 30-year period, and the cardinal who did Liturgiam Authenticam was Ratzinger way back in the 70s. But long term, that's not going to prevail, I've got to believe.
Yeah, there was even a statement, I think one of the cardinals, I think in Venice or so, but anyway, the statement was that before the council we had some brilliant theologians. Of course, before the council they weren't called brilliant, they were called heretics, but I mean now they're called brilliant theologians. And that keeps us from having brilliant theologians today, because you can't have two generations of brilliant theologians. And that the only two real theologians in the church are Joseph Ratzinger and John Paul II. Now you hear that and you say that, where do you go with that? But I think you're right. I hope that the council of the church is a council. But you know what you get? You get some of these young priests saying, oh, it's a pastoral council.
It's not a dogmatic.
It's not a dogmatic council.
Right.
The fact that it's a dogmatic constitution on the church or a dogmatic constitution on Revelation doesn't affect them at all. It's really a pastoral council, so we can ignore it. And I throw up my hands on that.
Talking about being or feeling demoralized, I see that in people. I think that ultimately, I have hope too, but I think we're going to go through another pretty long period of downward sliding before we kind of wake up again, and somebody slaps us across the face and says, wait a minute, we've moved in the wrong direction. And I see that in our politics too. You see the Tea Party or whatever having their religion, pushing their politics, rather than politics and religion influencing but not overriding. And with the whole country just feels demoralized, and I think our church is the same way. And I think just as the country as a whole is, the church is, and we're going to keep sliding for, unfortunately, I think for a while before we finally find some voices that are going to reawaken the spirit that's become dormant.
No, I think you're right. I think that there's in fact, when I put down some practical suggestions, I'm just going to read these and then we'll call it. But the first one, the long haul question, I think that there is something of value in both of those traditions, because they ultimately go back to the divinity and the humanity of Christ. And that if you push the divinity too much, you end up in Gnosticism. Push the humanity too much, you end up in Arianism. Right now, the Gnostics, or the pseudo-Gnostics, are claiming we've all become Arians, and the Arians are saying you're all, But I think at some point, we've got to have a respect for that which captures the immanence of Christ, and that which captures the humanness of Christ.
And to me, not to cut you off, but to me, being and studying right after all the documents started coming out in the seminary, that's what I felt enlivened about.
That's right.
I guess I was just before my time to begin with, but I felt that divinity and humanity together. I never felt growing up even that there was this, the divinity was way up here and divinity was over here, which also put us over here. And then Vatican II came along and it was like, whoa, yes, it's married as it should be.
Yeah.
But now we're
pushing. Now you get like, oh God, you gave us the memory of your passion.
Yeah,
That's
we're right back to this way instead of inclusive this way.
But one of the things let me just, these are practical things for what they're worth. First one is, don't be afraid to translate the printed text into prayer text. I think that the most important decision we can make as a priest is to say, I am not here to recite, I am here to lead people in prayer. And therefore, don't be afraid to do that. Will some people object? Yeah. But I'd also say in doing it, don't stay away from neurologic terms. There are only a handful of them, like, the many, chalice, consubstantial. Everyone gets excited about that, and those are buzzwords that get bishops all nervous, and probably, if they were fighting, they'd probably, use the same problem. But there's so many ways in which you can translate this stuff into prayer. One of which is not to let the book determine how you pray, but let the book serve the way you pray. That's the most thing. And to use, there are things that were in the book that were significant and are now stuck in the back of the book. You almost can't find them. Well, I said, good, bring them back out again. If you're used to doing that sprinkling rite, well, you'll have to hunt it down, but bring it out again. Or in the back of the book, the reconciliation stuff, which is also stuck in the back of the book, the litany style. They're served as samples. Look at the samples. Great. Use your creativity. We use the for the 6 Sundays of Lent, we use the 6 penitential psalms, and we use the baptismal blessing for the Easter thing back and forth, as different ways of enlivening, keeping the wisdom of the old sacramentary alive in our praying with this book. I think that wisdom shouldn't be lost. And the wisdom is couched in certain forms of prayer that are now hidden but can be. I think a lot of people tend to use the reconciliation prayers or the prayers of special occasions as far more interesting. They can pray them better. Those are different ways in which the wisdom of the council can stay alive even using the old book, and the new book, by simply bringing into their own proper things that the book itself wants to hide. And I even say, don't be afraid to laugh. Some of these things are laughable. You get to the end of the thing, you say, oh God, you deserve better than this. There's something in you that says, I not only can't pray this, I can't even say this, But finally I'd say, don't use any prayer unless you're able to pray. Don't use any prayer unless you're able to pray. If you can't pray it, then you've got to change it, because you're not going to lead anybody else in prayer if you're not praying.
I have one line. If you haven't seen the Exotic Marigold Hotel, there's this Indian guy in it, and he says, don't worry, everything is going to turn out very well in the end. If it's not well yet, it's not the end yet. This kind of stuff.
I was going to say, I remember from the 70s a TV program where a Benedictine monk in Spain was asked, what is prayer? What is prayer? And he said, there's no such thing as prayer. There are only people who pray. And, you know, you don't have a book. There is no such as a book of prayers. They're only an aid to help people pray.
Right. You know, even as Jesuit, you know, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius, they talk about, well, there's two formal prayers. I said, the spiritual exercises are a prayer. They're guides.
Yeah.
They're guides to bring people into prayer. And I think the same thing I would say about any missal or any sacramentary we have. It's a guide to bring us into prayer. And if it doesn't do that, then there's no point doing it at all. At any rate, thank you.